Welcome to EPG Pathshala. This paper is the philosophy of law. The current module is on reservation and exclusion. The objectives of this module are to understand the concept of reservation in response to the problem of inequalities such as exclusion. This module was written by Bharat Kumar from IIT Indore. I'm Akash Singh Rathore from the Lewis University of Rome. Discrimination on the basis of race, caste, class, gender, religion, ethnicity, and for many other reasons is common throughout the world. In order to correct a number of these modes of discrimination, countries around the world have instituted policies such as affirmative action, affirmative employment, equal opportunity systems, and in India specifically, reservation. Reservation is meant to deal with a particularly difficult and intractable form of systemic inequality that's built into the caste system. While the caste system provides members of predominantly the upper castes with a sense of identity and understanding of their place in society, for the lower castes it's led to systemic inequality and problems that are most apparent in the concept of untouchability. The disease of untouchability has permeated our society. This has been diagnosed, especially in the late 18th and very early 19th century, by a number of social reformers. But as the momentum for the Quit India movement and freedom of India took priority, took center stage, a great deal of the energy behind social reform dwindled out, such that by the late 19th century, most of the focus was on Swaraj, or attaining independence, and the social reform was put onto the back burner, so to speak. Now, the long drawn-out struggle for many decades had initial difficulties. In fact, more than decades, for almost 2 centuries, had difficulties because certain sectors of the Orthodox Hindus believed that caste was built in organically to their religious practices and beliefs. The customs of treating untouchables by our society, the practices of untouchability, greatly lowered the social status of these people. Their dwellings were outside of the village. They weren't permitted to use public tanks, to enter certain public spaces, to enter religious spaces like temples and so on. This process of exclusion inevitably led to a status of deep inequality, while the principle that was meant to be upheld by the orthodoxy was that these are not unequal stratifications, they're simply different stratifications. The practical results, the material results, were that the stratifications were radically unequal, especially for the situation of the untouchables. Now, during the late 19th and early 20th century, Gandhi and Ambedkar in particular were two outspoken social reformers deeply opposed to the practice of untouchability. They had quite different approaches to the problem, however. Gandhi saw the movement to eradicate untouchability as a sacred ritual of self-purification, in this case to purify the collective Hindu consciousness. It was, in effect, something for the caste Hindus to purify themselves of. So the agency in this respect was attributed to the caste Hindus. They are the ones who are to eliminate the practice of untouchability, since they are the ones who are practicing it. In this sense, for Gandhi, it was purely a religious question, and that too an internal one for Hinduism. It didn't necessarily bleed out into economic and political spheres. Ambedkar, on the other hand, defined the problems in terms of building a political identity for the Dalits within the structures of social, economic, and political powers. So Ambedkar articulated it not as something to be solved through religion, but that religion was the problem to be solved. So the social, economic, and political spheres were deeply implicated in Ambedkar's approach. Gandhi and Ambedkar have consequently produced some rival camps, rival ways of understanding the practice of untouchability and the means for eradicating it. For many years, predominantly since the 1930s, the two sides, the Gandhians and the Ambedkarites, couldn't see eye to eye and would often praise one at the expense of the other. The Dalit literary critic D.R. Nagraj was one of the first and earliest in the 1980s to attempt to see both aspects, the Gandhian and the Ambedkarite, as essential to overcoming this intractable problem of untouchability. D.R. Nagraj, in his article Self-Purification versus Self-Respect, argued that while Ambedkar and Gandhi were political adversaries, in the India of today, we need both. We need Ambedkar to remind ourselves that while criticism and even anger are sometimes necessary, so are action and reconstruction. Both Ambedkar and Gandhi were not the same persons that they were when they set out on the journey of engagement and debate with one another. They were deeply affected and transformed by each other. Dr. Ambedkar extended the very scope and definition of the Dalit cause. It was no more a question of mere untouchability. Thanks to his interactions with Gandhi, the Dalit cause for Ambedkar had become a larger, holistic understanding of untouchability. Because of the confrontation, both of them had changed their emphasis. To put it crudely, Gandhi had taken over economics from Ambedkar, and Ambedkar had realized the importance of religion. Both Gandhi and Ambedkar can and should be made complementary to each other when we're dealing with these issues with respect to exclusion and reservation. Surely such efforts will be met with stiff opposition from hardened ideologues, and they're bound to unearth fresh evidence to fuel the fire between the two. One way of fighting such tendencies, apart from pointing out the political necessity of exercise of incorporating both, is to file a philosophical caveat highlighting the notion of ontological difference to distinguish between contingent details of historical fact and the truth of a deeper historical concern. At the level of deeper historical truth, the conflicting fact disappears to reveal the underlying unity. This was the argument of D.R. Nagraj in his work on Gandhi and Ambedkar that appears in the book The Flaming Feet. Now, Nagraj argued that the two diverse ideas behind eradicating untouchability in Gandhi and Ambedkar could be characterized as one of self-purification, the Gandhian one, versus self-respect, the Ambedkarite one. Since Nagraj's writings in the late 80s and early 90s, a number of other sociologists, political philosophers, historians, and scholars have attempted to build upon this idea of bridging the work of Gandhi and Ambedkar. Some salient works on this were produced by Thomas Pantham, the political philosopher, by Partha Chatterjee, the subaltern studies historian, and by Ramchandra Guha, the historian of India. Now, the problem of reconciling Gandhi and Ambedkar derives from a very difficult quarrel that they had that culminated in the Pune Pact Agreement in 1932. In 1930, Dr. Ambedkar had demanded at the Round Table Conference in London a separate electorate for the what were known as the depressed classes. Essentially, we refer to them now as the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. The demand for separate electorates for these castes or classes was granted by the then Prime Minister of Britain. Gandhi was opposed to this as he realized that in the process of separating the untouchables from the rest of the Hindu community, the problem of untouchability would be taken out of the hands of caste Hindus. They would have no part to play in purifying themselves of this sin of untouchability. And also from the political angle, if you agree that Gandhi made certain politically astute decisions, he also realized that the population of the Hindus would radically decrease in comparison to Muslims and other minorities that were vying at that moment in history for political power in the new India. Gandhi went on a hunger strike, a fast, and he was committed to that fast until death. if the policy of separate electorates should be implemented. Ambedkar was left with the unenviable decision of whether to let Gandhi die in this circumstance or whether to agree and remove the award of separate electorates for the depressed classes. Ambedkar, of course, relented to the pressure because he realized Gandhi was too valuable to the freedom struggle to let him die on this issue, and he and Gandhi came to certain terms on, in place of separate electorates, reservations for these depressed classes. And this has come to be known as the Pune Pact. Now, how bitter this quarrel was resulted in the difficulty of reconciling Gandhi and Ambedkar for nearly 50 or 60 years after the signing of the Pune Pact. Well, the whole idea of reservation is meant to minimize the socioeconomic gaps that are there in society and uplift the depressed classes, those classes or castes that were deprived of social, economic, and political equality for, if not millennia, then at least certainly centuries. Reservation policy definitely works as an inclusive strategy for those who have been excluded, for the upward mobility of many communities within the scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and other backward castes, OBCs, as it provides reserved seats for them, not only for public institutions, but also in other aspects of job sector and education and politics. Now, these reservations are constitutionally provided for, so they're built into the very structure of the basic law in India, while the idea behind them was that after 10 years the corrective or the remedial results would be visible. They've continued to carry on for more than 60 years with many successes, but with also a great deal of further problems that derive as a consequence of the practice. So what are the constitutional provisions about reservation? The Constitution guarantees special provisions to be made for the uplift of these depressed classes through a twofold strategy. So on the one hand, one of the strategy was to protect just a regular legal safeguard to protect them against discrimination. So these are the clauses about equality in the Constitution that we find in Articles 14, 15, 16, and 17. Article 17 is special in this respect because it absolutely abolishes the practice of untouchability. This is simply a decisive statement that untouchability is illegal in this country. And this is a special protective measure. Obviously, it protects people against the practice of untouchability. This is only one aspect of the twofold process. The second side of this is not just mandating equality, but to offer a sort of unequal status, unequal in the sense of enjoying more privileges than the general population. These added privileges are precisely those reservations. So in this sense, we have within the Constitution prohibiting practices of inequality. So, for example, Article 17, that untouchability is illegal, and practices of attempting to lift the status of these communities up so that they are indeed functionally equal, since the mere prohibition of discrimination doesn't really solve the centuries of discrimination, both built into the social system and built into the material lives of these people. In other words, even though untouchability is abolished, it's still the case that it's largely practiced, and figures on exclusion have been given in other modules in this paper. So we see that reservation as a policy and built into the Constitution is meant to provide for a situation of equality that can allow us to eventually overcome the distinctions of caste that lead to discrimination. But here we already see a conceptual problem. How is it that we're attempting to overcome the problems of caste that lead to discrimination by making caste more concrete and solid. In other words, in order to enjoy the privileges that reservation grant, one has to declare one's identity very clearly and solidly. So if I were to enjoy a reserved seat, for example, in an educational institution, I would not only have to declare, but have to prove through governmental processes that I belong to a specific caste, which is registered as a scheduled caste, or let's say scheduled tribe or OBC. So that means that the attempt to overcome caste occurs through a process of making caste more rigid and solid. And this irony built into the practice of reservation has led to a great deal of criticism and critique from sociologists and political historians. Dipankar Gupta, André Bete, and others have suggested that we need an alternative. But you have to keep in mind that this argument relies on two fundamental premises for which we have no evidence. The first premise is that if we hadn't taken this practice of reservation, which relies on the ossification or strengthening of castes, the assumption is that over the last 60 years, of its own, caste would have decreased. Now, we have no way to verify this, and considering how the remnants of caste and discrimination are so powerful today, intuitively it just doesn't seem correct. Secondly, the suggestion relies, or the posing of that problem relies on another premise, which is that if we were to dismantle the reservation system in order to accord with fixing this conceptual problem that to overcome caste we strengthen caste, if we were to dismantle the reservation program, we haven't got yet any adequate alternatives put in place to achieve at least that quantity of results that we have definitely achieved till now through the policies of reservation. So while it's true that we face conceptual problems with the way that reservation policy is to be implemented, nevertheless, we don't know what the alternative of not doing it would have been, and we certainly can't assume it would have been better, and we also don't have alternatives, if we scrap it, for achieving the same kind of results that we have certainly achieved until now. Now, there's also another argument about reservation, which is referred to as a creamy layer argument, that reservation never helps those who are really needy, but instead it creates a tiny minority within the scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and OBCs who enjoy and monopolize all of the benefits, and they have prospered because of the reservation policy, while the great masses of people have not prospered. This argument is based, again, on a conceptual notion which is not necessarily empirically verified. We do know that there are a great number of prominent, dominant SC, ST, and OBC families, and even subcastes or communities that have risen to the level of middle to upper class as a consequence of reservation policies. But have they dominated, have they occluded the other members of this community in the process of their rise? Let's assume that this were so. It's built on a model that there are only so many resources, and when some enjoy resources, others naturally lose out on resources. If that model is correct, then the very attack on reservation fails, because what it suggests is that in any society, when some go up, others necessarily have to go down. This means that it's an attack on the caste system itself, as opposed to an attack on the creamy layer results of the implementation of reservation. I hope you understand this, the way this argument works. It suggests a zero-sum game in economic upliftment. Now, we're not entirely sure that economic upliftment consists of a zero-sum game. In fact, all policies of liberal democracy assume rather that everyone within society can rise. Economic growth wouldn't make sense unless that growth were able to be shared inclusively with all members of society. So conceptually, the argument is problematic, but also empirically. We know that certain subcastes have benefited concretely and produced a creamy layer, but to suggest that in the process of doing so, they have marginalized others is not empirically verified. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that that did in fact happen. So let's grant the suggestion that certain members of the scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and OBCs are monopolizing privileges within reservation policy. Is that any different from the way society works overall? Is it not the case that certain castes, and communities within society always do monopolize resources? Isn't that the very problem that we face, that we're trying to solve through reservation? So simply because the policy of reservation reenacts certain inequalities built into political and economic society as such, doesn't mean that you dismantle reservation, because clearly we haven't dismantled society as such. So there are many arguments put forward against reservation, that it should be dismantled, that the policy should stop, that it's unfair, that it is a reverse discrimination against the general categories, and so on. And these are very serious issues that need to be taken up. I have to say that these issues aren't adequately taken up by either side of this debate, primarily because the problem of caste and the sensitivities to it continue to be so intractable this many years after the attempts to abolish it and correct it. So what this suggests is, as we're in the process of rethinking reservation policy and carrying out the debate, we want to always keep in mind that the issues of caste inequality need to be at the forefront of our considerations. So the need to redress caste inequalities, whether it be through a policy of reservation or through other strategies that we can devise, have to always be pegged to this fundamental reason for which they were put forward in the first place. We have a community, or a set of several communities, that have been systematically excluded from the social, economic, and political benefits enjoyed by the rest of society. And any policies that we put forward, whether they're reservation or otherwise, need to remain pegged to this notion of exclusion and the possibility of finding strategies for inclusion that overcome the inequalities that people suffer. In conclusion then, as long as there's imbalance in society in terms of access to capital assets, employment, education, political participation, and other spheres, there will remain a need for practices such as reservation, affirmative action, positive discrimination, equal opportunity policies, and so on, in order to bring those discriminated subgroups into the fold of political, social, and economic equality. There are, of course, pro-poor policies that should always be implemented, irrespective of caste or ethnicity or other marks of identity. The fact that we still have a huge mass of poor needs to keep us in check of creating only policies to deal with the poor of a certain caste or ethnicity. So pro-poor policies are going to be a constant necessity. And nevertheless, the constitution of that poor has to be understood in respect of certain historical circumstances. The poor just don't arrive out of thin air. They are generated by political society through inequalities. And for this reason, we may need reservation for a fair time to come. Thank you.